There's this attitude for the most part among African people in America in ridiculing other Africans that succeed academically as acting white. Or in other words, to have intelligence and to be studious in reading and learning is acting white. Like Europeans are the only ones that read and are intelligent, and in saying this makes you think that the self-esteem is so low that to be black is to be ignorant, poor, and hopeless. Now there are several factors that come into being. Not knowing accurately our history and contributions to world civilization, largely through Western education, neglecting the needs of African people in these Western institutions, constant media portrayals of the negative stereotypes of Africans, and several other social engineering motives that continue the cycle of poverty and hopelessness that exists among the masses of African people. If these Africans that reflect this attitude that to be smart and intelligent is acting white, knew the historic importance of education, wisdom, and understanding among Africans, they wouldn't make these ridiculous statements. We have been taught we were inferior for centuries, which created a low expectation of ourselves. Mike Tomlin, head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers in the NFL, has an interesting story. A close friend and college teammate of his named Terry Hammond said, "Mike doesn't talk about how intelligent he is. For the longest time, he didn't even want it whispered, written, or communicated. His mother got one of those proud parent of an honor student bumper stickers from his high school and put it on their car, and Mike quickly ripped it off. He didn't want anyone to know he was smart and making good grades. He wanted to be a regular guy like the rest of the kids because he didn't want to be called a nerd. He kept it hitting until his junior year as he made straight A's, and they put that in a Newport newspaper. It was out of the closet then that he was intelligent." This is a perfect example of how several Africans will hide their own intelligence of fear of being ridiculed. This is the type of atmosphere this Western society has created, and we conscious Africans have to counter. Without various forms of intelligence, education, and consciousness, you cannot fully function as a human being to reach your own maximum potential and make significant contributions to society. This film is an expression of the historic importance of African intelligence and how it endured from traditional African societies through the African Holocaust to a contemporary view. To keep in context, as the old African proverb, wisdom is wealth, and one of the most profound tools Africans have always used for freedom, justice, and equality. To understand the importance and influence of wisdom, knowledge, understanding, and education in pre-colonial African societies, let us first take a look at some quotes and assessments of non-African people on what they witnessed in traditional African societies. Pan-African scholar Walter Rodney, in his book Grounded with My Brothers, stated, "Most foreign visitors went to the city of Timbuktu. In the English language, Timbuktu is often used in a sense of the most backwards place on earth. Yet, as long ago as the 14th century, when Europe was emerging from its own dark ages, Timbuktu was the largest city in West Africa and one of the most famous in the world as a center of gold trade and a city of learning. There were numerous schools at all levels, including the Arabic language, and the Sankofa Mosque was the home of a university producing theologians, lawyers, linguists, and geographers." Leo Africanus gives an in-depth account of the intellectual life of the city. In Timbuktu, there are numerous judges, doctors, and clerics, all receiving good salaries from the king. He pays great respect to the men of learning. there was a great demand for books and manuscript imported from Barbary. More profit is made from the book trade than of any other line of business. And the king, of course, was Askia, the great king of Songhai Empire. In a city which was renowned for its trade in gold, there was more profit to be made in books than any other line of business. In other words, learning was valued more highly than gold. There is a wealth of African proverbs throughout the continent, especially in the wisdom of Ptah-hotep. Ptah-hotep was a philosopher and leading statesman in Egypt in 2400 BC. Having achieved the great age of 110, he decided to pass on the benefit of his experience by setting down a collection of sayings or wisdoms, and really gives insight into the life and philosophy of Egypt and the ancient world. Throughout the temples of Egypt, it was written on the temple walls, "Man, know thyself, and thou shalt know the gods." Ptah-hotep's most significant maxim, which was Maxim 41, states, "An ignorant man is so blind that he takes understanding for ignorance and his own ignorance for the ultimate knowledge. For him, darkness is bright and harm is useful. Live morbidly, more dead than alive, unaware of his real condition. His arguments are devious and false, twisting reality and bringing misfortune." It is also important to know that Ptah-hotep is widely considered to have written the first complete book ever in the world. King Solomon, when he took his father David's place as king of Israel, was approached by God in a dream while Solomon was in Gibeon. God asked Solomon, was there anything he wanted to be blessed with? Solomon responded by saying he was too young to lead the Israelite people, that he wanted an understanding mind to govern the people, to discern between good and evil. And in response, God said, "Because you ask of this, and not long life or riches or life of your enemies, I will not only give you a wise and discerning mind, but you will be the wisest of kings to ever live, and both riches and honor, so that none will compare to you, and your days will be lengthened." And according to this history of Solomon, people of all political arenas and social status from all over came to Solomon to seek wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. And this also leads to the example of the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba, named Makeda, visited Solomon to see firsthand his wisdom and understanding. She was thoroughly impressed and stayed in Israel for several months and ended up being intimately involved with Solomon, and they had a son. And in the Kibber Nagast, when Makeda went back to her home country and converted her people to Judaism, she then addressed a long speech to her nobles in chapter 89 and the new Israelites, and prayed to God for wisdom and understanding. In Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he articulates beautifully that the most crucial aspect of pre-colonial African education was relevance to Africans, in sharp contrast with what was later introduced. It had close links with social life, both material and spiritual sense, its collective nature, its many-sidedness, and progressive development in conformity with the successive stages of physical, emotional, and mental development of the child. No separation of education and productive activity, or any division between mental and intellectual education. This education produced well-rounded personalities to fit into that society, and these educational practices could be found on the eve of colonialism. As reflected in African indigenous knowledge systems, no one can be respected in the society except they had undergone adequate training that exposed them to the values that make themselves useful for personhood and relevant to society. For example, in examining indigenous African education and knowledge closely, we can see it involves understanding education as a means to an end, social responsibility, participation in ceremonies, demonstrations, praise, songs, storytelling, proverbs, folk tales, dance, music, environmental education, and other education-centered activity can be acknowledged and examined. University of Sankofa, which became a learning center for not only Africa but the so-called Middle East, with eminent scholars like Ahmed Baba, who authored more than 40 books on diverse subjects and owned a 1600-volume library in the 16th century. And let's lay to rest that Africa was purely about oral tradition with no script or literary history. Written scripts was in places like ancient Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia, Carthage, Nigeria, Mali, Sierra Leone, the Cameroon, Liberia, Ivory Coast is just a few examples. And also examine language more closely, extensively, as Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o reminds us when he says, "One of the worst robbers is that of African language. In the realm of culture, Africa has been robbed of languages in the most literal and figurative sense, so that even today Africa is still defining itself in terms of Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone linguistic zones." The historical and contemporary African contribution to science and technology is absent. Although research has documented indigenous technology in Africa in many areas that include manufacturing, agriculture, food processing, civil engineering, transportation, mining, and communication. Examples are the carbon steel produced in Kenya, or the astronomical observatory of Kenya, the Dogon of Mali with the plotting the course of the stars, the Nshago bone and the fractional geometry of the Congo, and the medical texts of ancient Egypt are a few examples. And also, ancient Egypt included the study of logic, mathematics, science, agriculture, and medicine. The traditional Kikuyu education was a lifelong process from childhood until death. It emphasized communalism, group cohesion, loyalty, how to care for our families, an expectation of care for the aged. It included direct instruction and apprenticeship. And every effort was made to ensure success or minimize failure. The individual within the group was part of an age group that went through specific rites of passage. They underwent initiations that inculcated leadership skills, sexual roles, the proper relationships between men and women, adult responsibility, tribal psychology, and had the opportunity to share and value group experience that instilled democratic process in government, crime, and punishment. This does not claim that traditional African societies were utopias, but embedded with each group were explicit and implicit rules, regulations, practices, and traditions that prevented the group from becoming disintegrated. Divorces were rare. Failures in the system were prevented through remediation, fair play, and the numerous opportunities that were provided to redeem one's self. Traditional African educational systems use their own languages, folktales, histories, legends, religions, and an intimate knowledge of their environments to perpetuate themselves and prepare themselves to confront alien cultures creatively. A total rejection of the traditional African heritage will leave African societies and Africans in other societies in a vacuum that can only be filled with confusion, loss of identity, and a total break in intergenerational communication. The essential goal of traditional education is still admirable and remains challenging. In contemporary thought, we need to understand what an educated person should be, not one that is only lettered and literate and is philosophically inadequate. In traditional Africa, the person is holistic and a well-integrated personality with positive moral dispositions and observance to the ethical norms and values of society. And only those who are educated in the holistic sense can make significant and meaningful contributions to their societies. In fact, identification of education with schooling itself raises further problems as education may be carried on outside of formal schools. In other words, schooling is not the only avenue of the process of education. Education can also take place outside the school, and because of the problem of over-institutionalized education through schooling, non-formal education, which entails processes of more highly specific learning, which may not take place in such design environments, which are nevertheless thought of as fundamentally different from normal socialization pattern.
Education refers to any act or experience that has a formative effect on the mind, character, or physical ability of the individual. In this sense, education is a lifelong process in what we continue to learn from experience through our lives. Hence, all kinds of experiences can be education, starting from the ones we learn at home, school, from the radio, television, and newspapers, and even the ones learned from society through a process of imbibing cultural norms. In the African culture, the concept of an educated person is broader since there is no such distinction between the educated person and the ideal citizen as we have in Western culture. To be ideal, cultured, or educated is thus a function of an aggregate of processes in which a person acquires community, cultural knowledge, skills, attitudes, values, beliefs, norms, and habits for the survival of the society. The Yorubas and their rich cultural proverbial heritage, literary education is not an end in itself, but only a vehicle of obtaining further information, for modifying attitudes and behaviors, and for achieving a better quality of the educated person. We have been conceptually decolonized in believing that it is only formal education that can afford a person to be successful, rather than emphasizing being a person of value as successful. All eyes are on paper qualification without intellectual creativity or problem-solving capacity. Thus, the result effects of these are obvious: examination, malpractices, nepotism, mediocrity at the expense of meritocracy in public, private, and corporate corruption, unemployment, and high crime waves, with the long-run effects of all these anomalies leading to political instability, social disorder, and stunted development. To the Africans, an educated person is one who shows evidence of a well-integrated personality, meaning being economically prudent, socially and politically competent, morally acceptable, and intellectually and culturally sophisticated. By economic prudence, we mean being economically efficient in the sense of possessing skills and knowledge that earns a means of survival, as well as making a contribution to the common good. Hence, a socially and politically competent person is one who has the ability to participate and does participate in decisions as affecting his or her life and that of others in his or her community. In our current state throughout the African world, we have to be critical and realize we need more educated Africans in the traditional African perspective, because they would be the embodiments of a well-integrated personalities. They will not be stooping to the mischief of putting African nations in the economic and political bondage through corrupt practices, and via being an educated person, they would generally be law-abiding, patriotic, self-reliant, and morally ingrained. But that is not our reality. And we also know that we can't only blame ourselves. There are many outside forces that contribute to this as well.